They were the masters of Iron Age Europe. Their leaders were men and women of legend, King Arthur of the Britons, the warrior queen Boudica, and Vercingetorix the Gaul. They had powerful priests called druids who practiced human sacrifice to their gods. They were bloodthirsty headhunters who fought naked in battle against spears and armor. But it all ended in tragedy. Their vibrant culture was wiped out of Europe. They were driven to the Atlantic fringes by the legions of Rome. They became the eternal victims, the romantic underdogs of history. Yet, 2,000 years later, their character still casts a spell. They were the people we call the Celts. But how much is myth and how much is true? I'm Richard Rudgley, and I've made it my business to delve into our history, to try to find out what makes us who we are today. Now I want to add another piece to our historical puzzle. I want to explore that elusive part of our past that we call Celtic. Even after 2,000 years, a mythical Celtic world still grips the popular imagination. But I think very few people understand who the Celts actually were or what their legacy truly is. If you ask most people, they'd probably say the Celts lived in Ireland, Scotland and Wales. Their descendants are the kind of people you might spot at traditional Highland games in Scotland. Some people have no doubts about being a Celt. Are you a Celt?
Yes.
Simple answer.
Yes, definitely.
Simple as that.
I just see myself as a Scotsman.
Any nation that had a strong clan set up, I mean, I think that's where you find the Celts.
Clan is a Gaelic word for children. Here in Scotland, it means a tribal family.
You know, and I think a Scot and a Celt are very similar things. Although I think there's Celts in Wales and Ireland as well, isn't there?
I can't speak for what is a Celt, but I can speak for there's a lot of pride in Wales. That's why we're in St David's kilt, and we're proud of our language, you know, and I'm going to gyfalu efo popeth yn y dyfodol. We're going to look after everything in the future.
So a Celt is someone living on the fringes of the British Isles, who has red hair, wears a tartan kilt, and speaks a Celtic language like Welsh or Gaelic. But then these people also believe they're upholding Celtic tradition. Not a Scottish or a Welsh one, but a British one. There's not a kilt or caber in sight as these modern-day druids celebrate the autumn equinox.
I feel that Celtic is a culture that was absorbed by the people of this land during the Iron Age. And the Druids were really part of that culture.
Bounty of the boundless heavens.
Here, our Celtic heritage is thought to be pagan, British and essentially spiritual.
People see it as poetic, artistic, having an awareness that certain parts of the landscape held certain spirits, certain deities, the spirits of waterfalls and springs and streams, for instance. I think this really captures people's imagination.
These modern-day druids believe they are connecting with a mystical Celtic past and the pagan spirits of the earth.
Spirits of the West, to which our ancestors used to sacrifice in the streams, the rivers, the lakes, and in the bogs where the water meets the earth. Hail and welcome.
Hail and welcome.
But hang on, before we buy into this idea of the Celts as simply pagan, let's not overlook the X factor. In Ireland, possibly the place we most associate with the Celts, there's a whole other Celtic legacy, not pagan, but Christian. And if there's one thing that really shouts Celtic, it's a priceless treasure locked away in Trinity College, Dublin.
it's very much a Georgian building. Now the first floor there is called the Long Room, and it houses one of the most beautiful and indeed valuable artefacts from the early Christian period. It's known as the Book of Kells. Now the Book of Kells is basically a transcription of the four Gospels, but it's decorated in a very ornate, high Celtic style.
Made by Irish monks in the 9th century, the Book of Kells can still stagger us with its beauty. Its swirling patterns and intricate knotwork define the very look we recognise today as Celtic art. A style now so familiar that it's a Celtic cliché, seen on tea towels and jewellery across the world. And here in Ireland, there's another cliché, that there's a special kind of character that's uniquely Celtic. It's all about hospitality, drinking, music, and the gift of the gab. It seems to me that people can claim a Celtic link to confirm all kinds of things. A passionate national identity, a romantic pagan past, even a deep Christian spirituality. But what does any of this have to do with the ancient Celts? I want to reveal the true story of the Celts and discover why their world still evokes such passion today. My quest starts here in the Long Room in Trinity College, Dublin. Its library walls are stacked with manuscripts and translations of ancient Roman and Greek texts. They were copied by hand by the same monks who created the Book of Kells. In these books are my first clues to the origins of the ancient Celtic world.
I've just found this book written by the Greek historian Herodotus, the so-called father of history, and has a very interesting passage. That river flows from the land of the Keltoi and the city of Purani through the very midst of Europe. Now the Keltoi dwell beyond the Pillars of Hercules. Now this is one of the very first mentions of the word Celt in history. But Herodotus was also called the father of lies, because not everything he said was true. So I need to go to Europe to look for the archaeological evidence of these ancient peoples we call the Celts.
To uncover the secret history of the Celtic world, I'm embarking on an epic 4,000-mile journey. I'm travelling in the footsteps of the ancient Celts across the heart of Europe. But my journey to find them doesn't start in Wales or Ireland, but in Germany. I have to go back 2,500 years to a time when the Celts were masters of Europe. The Romans described the Celts as warlike and barbaric, but it was the Greeks that first wrote about them in the 6th century BC. They wrote of a people called the Keltoi, who lived in a place called Purana on the upper reaches of the river Danube. I've come here to the heart of Germany, to a place where archaeologists have spent 20 years uncovering the site of a massive Iron Age hill fort. It's called the Heuneberg, and it was occupied in the 6th century BC, the same period as the world of classical Greece. The Heuneberg doesn't look like the home of a barbarian tribe. It's a huge walled settlement. This reconstruction is only a fraction of the original, but it is in exactly the right place to be Purana.
So do you think this is the town that the Greeks mentioned, the first Celtic town in history?
Yeah, I think so. That this is this town Purana mentioned by Herodot, and he talked about a town in the land of the Celts in the region of the Upper Danube. And I think that this is the Heuneberg.
Heuneberg's location isn't the only evidence. The unique way these original walls were made shows that the people here were in touch with the Greeks.
The construction of the wall is really a Greek wall. We don't know if it was the Celts who built up the wall, or if they had Greek craftsmen who did the work and also the planning and the construction.
So you're saying that the Celts basically copied the Greek way of building here?
Yes, they copied, or maybe they had Greek craftsmen who built up the wall here in this place.
So it's in the right place, may have been built by the Greeks, so it's very good evidence that, in fact, this is the place.
Yeah, this is Pyrene.
It was farming that created the wealth to import luxury goods from Greece into these early Celtic chiefdoms. There's no evidence of war at Hoineberg. The massive walls weren't for defence. They were painted white and would have been visible from miles away. They were a status symbol.
So 2,500 years old and it's still standing.
Yes.
As more of the site is uncovered, there is mounting evidence of trade with the Greek world.
What makes you think that this is the place that Herodotus mentions in his book? Because it's an important hill fort, and also we have Greek findings here. We have Greek ceramics and Greek wine amphoras, which were imported here in this, at this site. Here we have Greek ceramics, was imported directly from Athens.
Classical Greece was a wealthy consumer society, and the barbarian north was rich in raw materials.
We also have proofs for textile production here in the settlement. We found a lot of these artifacts.
It's used in spinning.
Yes.
In exchange for textiles and manufactured items, these Celts imported luxury goods from Greece, and there was nothing more important to them than wine.
Then we have jewelry, for example, a bronze bracelet.
Okay.
And these artifacts were fabricated here at the site.
Far from being home to barbarians, this ancient Celtic town was a hive of industrial activity, weaving textiles, firing ceramics, and casting high-quality metalwork.
So why did they choose this particular location?
I think it's the situation near the river Danube. And the river Danube is an important trading line through Europe.
So the Celts were middlemen. So that was the prehistoric Autobahn, really?
Yes.
The Danube River.
Yes.
The word Celt was first used by the Greeks to describe many of the northern barbarian tribes. It is unlikely that most of them called themselves that. The name Celts was used in the same way as the word Indian was used to describe all the native tribes of North America. So what kind of people were they? To find out, I have come to the most spectacular burial of this early Celtic period. In 1978, a remarkable discovery was made beneath a field 100 miles to the north of Hoineberg, on the outskirts of a town called Hockdorf. This is the Hockdorf Prince. I'm now face to face with my first ancient Celt, but this is not a warrior's grave. The only weapon here is a small iron dagger decorated with gold. This Celtic prince is laid out in luxury on a Greek-style bronze couch covered with furs and fabrics. Round his neck is a golden torque, and on his head he wore a strange conical hat made of birch bark. All about him lay the trappings of immense wealth and power. A four-wheeled decorated wagon was laden with feasting and drinking equipment. And in one corner stood an enormous Greek cauldron that could hold 70 gallons of wine. This prince took his entertaining very seriously indeed.
This spectacular array of goods and equipment gives us a unique portrait of the life of an ancient Celtic prince.
The deceased chief was laid on this chariot and was carried into his tomb. And this iron masterpiece is really unique. They were really very, very elaborate in blacksmith working.
What can this breathtaking grave tell us about the early Celtic world in Central Europe?
Well, it tells us that he had international contacts, that he was part of these cultures around the Mediterranean world, that they could exchange ideas, that they could exchange goods. And all you can see here, his signs of power as a chief of this tribe in Hochdorf.
So it's really like a throne, except you lie down on it instead of sit on it.
It's a huge bronze throne, or a throne where you lay on, as the Greeks did in this time.
My first Celt isn't a headhunting warrior at all. He's a cultured diplomat, in touch with the most advanced people of the ancient world, the Greeks. He traded in Greek goods, and probably Greek ideas too.
So what was it that made people like the prince rich?
It was the new Iron Age. It was the iron itself. They were mining the iron, and with the iron started a totally new dimension in trading.
So the Greeks?
With the Greeks. So we can really say this is the beginning of the Celtic world in Central Europe.
So I found the first Celts, the city of Purena and a Celtic prince. But neither match classical descriptions of barbaric Celts, nor do they seem to have much in common with our present-day notions of Celticness, except that the Hochdorf prince was clearly a bit of a drinker. Archaeology reveals that 50 years after the death of the Hochdorf prince, the old Celtic settlements of central Germany suddenly vanished. Something had changed. A new Celtic society was emerging, and power shifted to the west. To find the evidence, I have to head to the most famous Celtic site in Europe. I'm here on the shores of Lake Neuchâtel in Switzerland. Today it's a simple holiday resort, but more than 2,000 years ago, it was a site of ritual offering and sacrifice. And it was to coin the international brand name of the Celtic world, a name synonymous with both beauty and with violence. This is Laten. In the 5th century, the waterfront at Laten was neither cemetery nor settlement. It was a sacred religious site. For the ancient Celts, water was the gateway between this world and the next. It was here they offered tribute with their most precious possessions. In 1857, the Swiss archaeologists stumbled on a huge hoard of Celtic offerings preserved in the muddy floor of the lake bed. More than 2,500 objects were recovered. They would make the name Laten forever associated with the Celtic world.
So this is all from Laten?
Yes, it's all from the site of Laten, hundreds of pieces of iron and tools in wood.
The most striking feature of this new Celtic culture was the amount of weaponry, finely decorated with a distinctive art style.
But the decoration here is very, very, very fine. Huh?
The decoration is all these swirling lines.
It's coming here.
Is this the typical Laten style?
Yes, of course, this is it.
Curving lines.
The finds at Laten mark the beginning of the swirling patterns that we have now come to recognize as distinctively Celtic. The magical and symbolic reworking of animal, plant and spiral designs would define the international Celtic look for centuries. It's astonishing that a society without writing was able to produce such geometrically complex works of art. But from the lake bed at Laten came other, more grisly finds. Among the swords and shields was found evidence of human sacrifice.
We have found a series of skulls, and the question, are these people dead by an accident or killed by sacrifice? We have found one with a rope on the site of Laten in the 19th century.
So you know that people were sacrificed or at least executed?
Probably they have had some problems.
Some problems, that's a big problem.
Archaeology shows that by the 4th century BC, Laten Celtic culture had spread rapidly from Central Europe into the Balkans and Italy and westward to Spain and France. I want a taste of this warrior culture, so I've come to meet a group of German archaeologists whose mission it is to bring the Celtic world to life as authentically as possible.
So there's a chainmail. Right,
thanks. Is the old member of the team?
Yeah.
The first thing I must do is to dress the part of an authentic Celtic warrior.
And what's the choice?
Chalk or chainmail?
Let me have a think.
Before 300 BC, most Celtic warriors preferred to fight naked in battle. Their only defense was body paint, a shield, and trust in their gods.
I think I'll go for this chainmail.
Chainmail, okay.
The most important thing a Celtic warrior had to wear was the torque.
Looks brilliant, eh?
It's the sure sign of a Celtic nobleman.
Yeah, looks fine.
It's a bit ostentatious.
After centuries of fighting, war was a cultural thing for the Celts, but it was also an income. Celtic warriors had such a reputation that they were in high demand as mercenaries. Celtic warfare was all about drama and display. One of the most terrifying sounds on the battlefield was made by the boar-headed war carnix. Scores of these war trumpets would be sounded to instill fear into the enemy. The Romans described Celtic battle tactics as simple but effective. First, the enemy was taunted.
Imagine 10,000 of Celts doing this. Quite impressive, I think.
Yes.
The bravest warriors would then charge forward. The whole force would then rush the enemy, trying to make them panic and run. And if it didn't work the first time, they'd simply walk back and start all over again. We tend to think of the Celts as underdogs, a people who would easily have been pushed aside by superior Roman technology. But this just wasn't true. Celtic technology was originally more advanced in many ways than that of Greece or Rome. The chainmail I'm wearing was a Celtic invention of the 4th century BC, and use of iron nails would revolutionize Celtic shipbuilding techniques. With their swords, iron-wheeled chariots and metal horseshoes, the Celts led military campaigns against neighboring tribes and even against the Greeks and Romans. In 390 BC, Celtic tribes sacked an expanding city-state called Rome. The Romans would steal lots of ideas from the Celts, but there was one Celtic practice that really appalled them: headhunting.
There we are. Take this back to England.
The Romans said that the Celts kept human heads both as trophies and as offerings to their gods. A Celtic shrine just like this one was found in southern France.
And now, touch this ring and feel the spirit of Celtic way of life.
Thank you.
The early Celts were far more than simple barbarians. They were technically advanced, rich and powerful, and their complex culture stretched from Spain to Turkey. But what I want to find out is, did the Celts deserve their barbaric reputation, or was it Roman propaganda? To find the evidence, I've come to northern France, to the battlefields of the Somme. The landscape here is littered with the bones of thousands of unknown warriors from the First World War. And it was during that conflict that soldiers digging trenches at Ribemont stumbled upon the remains of a much earlier conflict. They found the bones of men aged from 15 to 40 years old, all bearing the marks of violent trauma. They had unearthed the Celtic War Memorial on the site of a battle in which thousands of warriors had fought and many had died. This was no ordinary shrine. And what it reveals gives us a remarkable insight into the Celtic world's attitude towards war and death.
We can say that there were hundreds of warriors killed. More or less 500 died. It was a huge battle.
The battle was fought around 280 BC between two warring Celtic tribes.
The defeated warriors were a Brittany tribe called Armoricans. The victorious warriors were called Ambions. That's to say, a Belgian tribe.
In the 3rd century BC, Europe's Celtic tribes were jostling for territory. Despite the culture they shared, they were much more likely to be fighting each other than cooperating. There are hundreds of slain warriors here, both victors and vanquished, but there is something missing. There are no heads, there's not a single skull amongst the thousands of bones. Is this evidence that what the Romans said about beheading was true?
We have in Ribemont found some neck vertebrae which show signs of cutting by a knife. which is evidence of beheading.
Qui ont amené donc ce découpage de la tête.
At Ribemont, no skulls remain because they were all taken back to the victors' villages as trophies and memorials. What puzzled the archaeologists was not just the beheading, but the curious way the bones were scattered on the ground. A ritual had taken place after the bodies were decapitated.
Alors ici, ce sont les...
They were transported from the battlefield and displayed as a Celtic war trophy above the ground for several years.
Pendant plusieurs années.
The headless bodies of the vanquished were hung with their weapons on wooden frames. When they had rotted and fallen to the floor, the bones were crushed and burnt. The bodies of the victors' dead were treated differently. Their bones were neatly stacked together to form an altar.
Et cette construction, nous l'interprétons comme une sorte d'autel.
And we think that this construction represents a kind of shrine built from crisscrossing human bones. Then the ashes from defeated warriors' corpses were placed in the center of the altar in order to honor their gods.
It's little wonder the Romans were horrified by such savage practices. But to the Celts, it all made perfect sense.
I think that the Celts were not savages or barbarians. Quite the opposite, in fact. In fact, Celts were very religious. They treated the remains of their enemy with the same religious respect that they treated their own warriors' corpses.
The discoveries at Ribemont confirm that the Celts placed a spiritual value on the human head. What the Romans thought were savage acts of brutality were actually part of a complex religious system. Archaeology shows that by 200 BC, Gaul had stabilized. The Celtic tribes had put down roots and had begun to build permanent towns. I've come 300 miles south to Coron. This was home to another powerful tribe called the Averni. Excavations here are revealing evidence of a highly complex culture. A society still obsessed with human sacrifice, but now becoming entwined with power and politics. Although it looks like we're going to have a party, I've actually come to Coron to reenact a sacrificial beheading.
It's the best wine we could find. Yeah.
But it won't be a human victim, it will be a wine amphora. So we're doing a bit of experimental archaeology here, going back over 2,000 years, and I'm going to do my first wine sacrifice. Coron was a meeting place for Celtic tribes in Gaul. It was here that diplomatic gifts and favours would be exchanged. Evidence of this lavish hospitality is scattered everywhere.
We've got many amphora pieces, each amphora about 20 liters, and on the whole side we've got thousands of them.
How did they get all this wine? What did they exchange for the wine?
Ancient text says 1 amphora, 1 slave.
That's quite expensive wine, isn't it?
It's very expensive. That's human life.
The Celts, unlike the Romans and Greeks, drank their wine undiluted.
Greek and Roman traders were horrified by this practice. That's really barbarians that not mix wine with water.
Wine was precious because it symbolized a blood sacrifice. But how exactly do you sacrifice wine?
We can see that smash with the sword.
With a sword?
Amphora were sacrificed.
So they didn't just take the cork out?
No. That's a substitute for human sacrifice, because when you decapitate the amphora, the wine comes out like blood, like animal or human blood.
At special feasts, the floor of the sanctuary at Coron was strewn with decapitated amphorae, scattered around sunken pools of wine. As serious drinkers, the Celts brought hospitality to new levels of endurance. But Coron wasn't just for parties. It had a serious function as a place of diplomacy and politics. Here, they even minted their own currency. A wine amphora hasn't been sacrificed on this site for over 2,000 years. Until now.
Right here. Okay.
glass of wine.
In the Celtic world, nothing is quite what it seems. Headhunting and sacrifice weren't simply evidence of Celtic brutality. They were part of a complex religious world. For the Averni tribe, a blood sacrifice would soon become all too real when they chose to oppose the Roman invasion in 58 BC. From the ranks of the Averni tribe would come the Celtic world's most tragic leader, Vercingetorix the Gaul. At the start of the 1st century BC, Gaul was becoming increasingly Romanized. Centuries of trading had introduced a way of life not so different from the Roman. Just how sophisticated had Celtic society become? To find out, I've come north to Bibracte. Surrounded by its formidable ramparts, Bibracte was the capital of the Adwi. They were one of the most powerful tribes in Gaul.
Well, Richard, we just entered Bibracte, just passing through one of the 15 gates of this very important town of the 1st century BC.
Bibracte's 5-kilometre defensive wall was a huge engineering achievement, but it was more for show than practical defence.
So, what does this tell us about the Celts?
It tells several different things. Given the scale of this fortification, just 5 kilometers, 15 gates, it's huge. It shows that there was a high level of organization. So that means in this town there was an authority with enough power to force hundreds of thousands of people to build that.
Bibracte was one of the largest and most complex settlements in northern Europe. It had an urban population of thousands and was, to all intents and purposes, a large town.
Just a small selection of the recent discoveries at Bibracte, just to give you an idea of the range. So you see the face of a boar, like the one you can see on the carnix. And actually, it's probably a small-sized carnix.
Oh, it's a spout for pouring wine.
Wine, probably.
What else?
This is a brooch, a bronze brooch. It was used by the women just to fix their dress.
The humble safety pin.
Yes. Another piece, completely different. Pieces of pottery. And the style of decoration is very typical for this region. I think it's typical for the Adwi, who had the capital here. So it's the Adrian style.
So you're saying the pattern is like a tribal form of identity?
Typically, yes. Each tribe in central Gaul had painted pottery, but with a different style.
We can picture Gaul as a mosaic of tribes fast developing into fledgling states.
So what does Bibracte tell us about the Celtic world?
Well, very simply, that Bibracte was a proper town. So that means these Iron Age societies had turned just to become an urban civilization and to create proper towns with thousands of inhabitants, with quarters, with public activity, with residential quarters, and so on. I would say that the Gauls had a civilization which was as complex as the Roman one at the same time.
The Adwi were a powerful tribe, but a showdown with the expanding Roman Empire was becoming inevitable.
So, Vincent, how far up are we?
820 meters over sea level. You can imagine that Rome is just somewhere, in the fog in the distance, not so distant from here.
How much the Gauls shared a common Celtic identity would be tested by a Roman invasion. It was in Bibracte that Vercingetorix was proclaimed head of a loose confederation of tribes in an attempt to unite against Julius Caesar's legions. The Gauls would not face the Roman army in open battle. Instead, they adopted hit-and-run tactics. After 6 years of skirmishing, Vercingetorix made the mistake of regrouping his forces at the hill fort at Alesia. It was here Caesar would finally confront these Celtic tribes in 52 BC. Today, all that's left of Alesia are the ruins of the later Roman town. Yet the site still reveals something of what the victor felt about the vanquished. This is a bronze figure made by the Romans and discovered here at Alesia in 1907. It's a dying Celt made of bronze. And I think images like this show the power not only of the Romans over the Celts, but the Celts over the Roman imagination. This is an image of a noble savage, despised at one level and admired on another.
Alesia is the place of a turning point of the European history. On this place, in the autumn precisely of 52 BC, the Roman armies of Julius Caesar defeated the Gauls.
Merci, t'arrives juste enlever la main, s'il te plaît.
It is a compliment to the Gauls that Caesar chose to lay siege to Alesia rather than face them in open battle. He began by building 15 miles of ditches.
So Vercingetorix was trapped on this site, which was a hilltop, with tens of thousands of his troops with him, and the Roman troops completely made a circle, a fortification all around the hill, on the edge of the hills behind us.
Vercingetorix called for reinforcements, but Caesar built a second line of defense to guard against a Celtic counterattack.
So we are dealing with 15 miles of ditches with something like 23 Roman forts, with tens of thousands of Roman soldiers everywhere watching Vercingetorix of his troops.
The showdown finally came when up to 250,000 Gauls rallied to aid their tribal cousins. But the Celtic temperament was broken by Roman discipline, and Vercingetorix would be starved to submission in Alesia.
The Romans had to wait till these people were starving and they had run out of water and food, and at the time they just surrendered and gave Vercingetorix to the Roman general.
After centuries of tribal independence, Vercingetorix had tried to unite the Gauls against a common enemy, but it was too little, too late.
Was this a tragic day for the Celts?
It was definitely a tragic day for all the tribes which were involved in this battle. If we consider that these people were all Celts, it was certainly a very important day for all these people.
And if there'd been a different outcome, do you think we'd have a different Europe today?
I think it's very clear from our modern point of view that history would have turned to a completely different story if this battle hadn't taken place.
If the Gauls had won, who knows what a Celtic Europe would have looked like? 2,000 years on, the romantic myth of what might have been still has a powerful hold over the French nation.
Military monuments are nothing unusual, but this statue's different because Vercingetorix lost. It's here because it's become a symbol of the French nation. And the first person to articulate this idea about Vercingetorix was the very man who defeated him, Julius Caesar. He said that if all the Gaulish tribes could unite, they could defy the universe. Quite a thought, especially if you're a Frenchman.
The expanding Roman Empire had crushed the Celts in continental Europe. Within a few generations, all traces of their language, art and culture had disappeared. Or had they? Today in Ireland and Scotland, many people are convinced that they're the descendants of this race of ancient Celts, the last remnants of an ethnic group pushed to the margins of Europe as the Romans advanced. But does the evidence support this? The first clue is in the most unlikely place, Battersea, just by the power station. In 1857, a remarkable treasure was dredged up from the River Thames, a beautifully decorated bronze shield. And just downriver at Waterloo, another object was discovered, an extraordinary horned helmet. Because both were found in water, and their exotic decoration was similar to the Celtic objects uncovered that same year at La Tène in Switzerland, Victorian archaeologists quickly put two and two together. They deduced that Celtic tribes must have migrated to Britain from Europe, bringing their art with them.
Well, here, Richard, is the Battersea Shield, and I'm holding the Waterloo helmet. These objects are renowned throughout the world for being classic Celtic objects.
So it's a really stunning piece of work, isn't it?
It's a stunning piece of work. It's also an incredibly complicated piece of work.
What was it about this type of art that was so important?
it becomes an international language, so associated with people of prestige, which spread across the whole of Europe amongst the elites.
These amazing objects look the business, but they aren't quite what they seem.
We call this a helmet, we call this a shield, but neither of these would ever have been used in battle. The shield is essentially a showpiece, it's a decorative object, and this isn't really a helmet, it's probably a piece of ceremonial headgear. And of course the point about this is that it's held on your head like a party hat.
Makes me feel like going to a party.
Beyond any doubt, these objects are masterpieces of Celtic art. But archaeologists today are less convinced by the Victorian idea that they came to Britain with Celtic migrants from the continent. In fact, some people seem to have a bit of a problem with the C word.
Do you think these objects were made by people who were Celts?
They're made by people we would call Celts today. Whether or not they would understand the word Celt is a different matter. Certainly they've got Celtic art on them, but what's, I think, important to recognise is that these are very British objects. The style of Celtic art, the style of the decoration, it shares something with other parts of Europe, but it's also at the same time distinctly British.
The helmet and shield are Celtic in style, but they weren't brought by migrating Celts. In fact, some of the finest examples of what we call Celtic art today were not imported. They were all made in Britain.
This is the Snettisham Great Talk, and is one of the most astonishing pieces of prehistoric metalwork anywhere from Europe.
These objects prove that the art style of the continental Celts was well known in Britain and adapted to local tastes. What the objects don't prove is that either they themselves or the people that made and used them had arrived from mainland Europe. The art alone simply isn't proof that Celtic tribes moved here. To establish that, I need a different kind of evidence. In Yorkshire, there may be just what I'm looking for at a place called Wetwang. In 1984, in a gravel pit, a digger uncovered the first of a series of intriguing finds that hint at the presence of Celtic immigrants, people buried with chariots.
This is the valley in the Wolds which has produced more chariots than virtually anywhere else, because out of the something like 15 chariot burials that have been uncovered over the last 200 years, all but 2 of them have been found on the Yorkshire Wolds.
That's strange, isn't it?
Very strange.
Burying your dead with a chariot is practically unknown in Britain, but it was an old tradition among some Celtic tribes in Europe, just like the 4-wheeled wagon burial in Hockdorf, Germany.
This is the site.
Here?
Yeah, this is where it happened.
13 chariots have been discovered in this Yorkshire Valley alone. In 1984, 3 were found in a row.
At this end there was a young bloke with his chariot and his sword and a shield. In the middle, the woman, and then beyond her, the second man. Now, the woman's grave was the best preserved. She was lying on one side. It looked like somebody had fallen off a bicycle and just decayed.
So we often think about Boudica as riding around in a chariot, and we think about war. Was that what the chariots were for, or were they for other things as well?
You could have used them for anything you like, and when there wasn't a war on, you presumably wouldn't have left it in the shed.
Buried along with this woman and her chariot was a collection of extraordinary personal items, a mirror, horse harnesses, and all her finery decorated in the familiar Celtic style. Like the Battersea shield, her grave goods were all made in Britain, as was the chariot itself. Now, using the fragments of evidence, the Wetwang chariot has been brought back to life.
So it's nice to see it, isn't it, in its full glory, like it would have been?
It's wonderful, yes. See, in the grave, you can see the rectangular shape where this has been. But that's all. It's like a sort of ghost of a chariot.
Chariots like this were widespread in Britain. They were used for war and transport. But chariot burials were unique. Is this proof that a warrior tribe of Celtic settlers came over from Europe bringing their foreign traditions with them.
It does suggest that the ideas have come across from the continent, because we know that many of the parallels here are also to be found in parts of Central and Western Europe.
Steady, steady. The most intriguing clue is that the Romans called this local tribe Parisi, and a European tribe, also called Parisi, would give Paris its name. Both tribes buried their dead with chariots. Were they the same people?
I think there must have been some kind of connection. What it actually was, whether the people had come here from, or any of them had come here from the continent.
But would you say they're Celts?
I wouldn't say they were Celts. I think that I don't tend to use the term. So-called Celts, if you want to.
Both the wet-wang chariots and the treasures dredged up from the Thames prove that Britons had connections with continental Celts. Some may have settled in southern England and Yorkshire, but there isn't evidence in England to prove that Celts came in sufficient numbers to drive out the local population. I'm on a journey to uncover the ancient Celts, to bring them out into the light after 2,000 years of myth-making. I found the earliest known Celtic town, not in the British Isles, but in Germany. And I followed the Celts on their journey through history. At Alesia in France, I stood on the spot where Vercingetorix the Gaul was conquered by Julius Caesar. His defeat marked the end of the Celtic world. Or did it? Today in Britain and Ireland, many people think they're the descendants of this race of ancient Celts, the last remnants of an ethnic group pushed to the margins of Europe as the Romans advanced. But does the evidence support this? My first problem is the Romans never called the people of Britain Celts, although they did say that the ancient Britons spoke a similar language to the Celts of Gaul. What about in Scotland, a nation we think of as Celtic today? I've come north to the Shetland Islands to explore one of the largest and most mysterious monuments of Iron Age Britain. It looks like a modern cooling tower, but this is an ancient broch. The ruins of more than 500 survive in Scotland today. They're the most dramatic evidence left by the people who lived here in the Iron Age. Musa Broch is the only one still intact.
Good to see you. This is amazing, isn't it?
Yeah, this is the best broch in the world. And in our Shetland Islands, this is the equivalent of the Great Wall of China. This is our most stupendous archaeological monument.
This amazing stone tower is over 40 feet high and built without an ounce of mortar.
This is a dry stone building. It stood here for 2,000 years. You can imagine the gales that have afflicted it during that period.
So what was the purpose of the broch then?
For the past 25 years, archaeologists have imagined that these buildings were farmhouses. I don't believe a word of it. This is a fortification.
Oh wow, look at this. It's even more impressive from inside, isn't it, than out?
Yeah.
Wow.
The interior of this broch would have had its own timber furnishings. It wouldn't have looked bare and unfinished in the way that it does today.
It's only when you get to the top of the stairs that you realise what the building was for.
You can imagine how commanding this building would have looked to anybody who was arriving from offshore.
Absolutely. They must have had a great view. They could survey the whole area. They could see attackers coming from a long way off, prepare themselves.
Yeah.
And they certainly left their mark.
They are by far the biggest things that were built here until the 20th century.
The brochs were built long before the Romans defeated the Celts in Europe. Were they built by Celtic migrants to Scotland?
It looks to me as if the people who built these things were an Iron Age people, presumably a Celtic people, who made their presence felt in a big way in the north of Scotland. Whether they called themselves Celts, of course, is an entirely different matter.
This in itself is a real feat, but when you add on all the hundreds of others, you realise that some big cultural construction's going on here. Someone's building themselves a culture, and a very enduring one at that.
But were the broch builders Celts? Brochs only exist in the north of Scotland, and there is nothing on the continent remotely like them. Surprisingly, the evidence from England, like the Battersea Shield and the Wetwang chariots, seems more Celtic than Scotland. In fact, there's no evidence in Scotland at all to suggest waves of Celtic migrants from Europe settled there in large numbers. So what about Wales? There's plenty of archaeology in Wales that enables us to reconstruct what daily life would have been like in the Iron Age for ordinary people. It should be possible to see if there are anything in common between Celtic culture and the culture of Britain BC. Castle Henlith is an Iron Age hill fort, and these roundhouses have been rebuilt on their ancient foundations.
These are attempts to reconstruct what was here originally. The most important thing about that to me is that when you go into them, you get a sense of place, a sense of sharing space with the people who lived there before.
This is as close as you can get to life as it was lived in Iron Age Britain in the centuries before the Romans.
Don't try and mess around with it too much, otherwise it'll just fall off. To build a roundhouse like this, you need lots and lots of resources. So the person who lived up here would be an important person, locally important.
Now, I'm going to give him the blessing of one of our gods before he goes into battle, and he's going to be blessed by Tyrannus, the god of thunder. Right, and
there are plenty of echoes here of the way European Celtic society was structured. Tribal groups, each with their own local identity, living in hill forts and fighting each other. Just like their continental cousins, they had formidable defences.
We call those a chevaux de frise, and basically it's a series of small stones that are set up on end, almost like a sort of Iron Age tank trap.
Well, your horse wouldn't want to come through here, would it?
No, no.
Not at all.
Well, you wouldn't want to run through here either.
If you did manage it, you'd get another nasty surprise. A slingshot hoard was found by the main gate.
Sling stones, every man's weapons. These are found by the thousand on hill forts. Here, there was over 2,000 in one cache.
Just like in Celtic Europe, the people here were warriors.
A hole in one.
There he goes, well done.
But they were also farmers, just like in Gaul, and they were using new iron tools, ones that we still use today.
So really the Iron Age was an industrial revolution in a sense.
Very much so. Once you start to produce tools exactly for the job, the styles don't change. We've got a couple of examples here, for instance. It's a digging tool for cultivating ground, preparing seed beds. Harvest tools, for instance, everybody recognises that one, sickle. The tool shape is identical, right the way for now 2,500 years.
They grew wheat, barley, peas and beans. Farming became more efficient because of the new iron tools.
The food production went up enormously to the point we were exporting.
So they were exporting grain to where?
To Gaul, of all places. The Romans were buying it for the Roman Empire.
Trade brought the people of Iron Age Britain into contact with tribes hundreds of miles away, even across the sea in Europe.
So all this effort to reconstruct the past, what has it taught us?
Well, it's taught me that the people who lived here in the Iron Age were sophisticated people. They had high skill levels, far more than most of us have today.
So would you say they were Celts?
I wouldn't know, because I think the person who lived here wouldn't have probably have heard of the word Celt. The Roman sources suggest that the tribe for this area was called Demetai. But there are so many individual forts close together that would suggest that there probably isn't any sort of centralised leadership.
So we're talking about clan-based societies rather than full-blown tribes?
Yeah, I think so. I think so.
Is it right to call the people of Britain BC Celts? I haven't found evidence of mass migration of European Celts to Britain, but what I have found in the British Isles is a culture that had very many similarities with the Celtic culture I discovered on the continent. And there's something else that connects Wales to European Celtic culture.
I mean, I feel Celtic as a Welshman, but I don't feel that Celticity can be drawn from the Iron Age necessarily. If you're going to sort of draw any relationship between present-day population of Wales and the Iron Age, you'd say that language is the key.
Today, 2 million people in Britain and Ireland speak a Celtic language. The greatest number are Welsh. If we listen hard, can we hear a distant echo of Britain talking 2,000 years ago? I've come to Aberystwyth to find out if the Welsh language can help me make an even stronger connection between the peoples of the British Isles and the Celts of Europe.
Richard, this is a map showing the Roman period and before tribal names and place names across Europe. There's the Iceni here, Boudica, and so, yeah. Over here, there's Demetai.
And again, Castell Henllys.
Yeah, Castell Henllys is there. Up here, you've got the Cornovii, right in the north. That's a horn of land, and corn means horn in Welsh. Of course, the same corn you get in Cornwall, another horn of land.
Before the Romans, there were many different tribes in Britain, but there was a common language that stretched from the Bruch builders of Scotland down to Cornwall.
You've got one language being spoken in slight varieties over the whole of Britain, but it carries on over into France as well. You can see that some of the tribal names actually recur. For example, here you've got the Atrebates. They're on your side somewhere.
Over here, yeah.
That's right. Then we've got, up here in Yorkshire, the Parisii.
Okay, this is the Wetwang chariot burial area.
That's right. And exactly the same name as Parisii around Paris. Now, some of these names may be the same without meaning it's the same people. But say Parisii and the ones up here, they were both using chariot burial. So maybe they're actually the same people who migrated.
Celtic languages on the continent died out with the Roman invasion. But there are surviving fragments of ancient Gaulish. Is it possible to compare them with the Welsh language and find a connection?
Here we've got some words in Gaulish on this side. That is the ancient Celtic language of France. And here we've got some modern Welsh words which correspond, just to show the connection between the languages. Mat means good or lucky, and mat turns up in later Welsh as mard. There's a slight change, but it's still recognised to be the same. That means lucky. Here's another Gaulish word, catus. That means a battle. Now that turns up as card in modern Welsh.
So with Welsh and with Gaelic and a few other surviving remnants of Celtic languages, do we see the last vestiges of something which was once Europe-wide?
I think we do. We're talking about a language which was spread with slight variations, of course, all the way from Portugal to the Black Sea and even into Turkey. But it's only survived on the Atlantic fringe.
It's astonishing that the people of the British Isles spoke a language that was in use right across Europe. And yet there's little evidence that Celtic tribes migrated to Britain and Ireland from the continent. However, it is clear that the people of the British Isles shared culture and language with the continental Celts. And by that definition, the Iron Age people of Britain and Ireland could be called Celtic. In 43 AD, 100 years after the Romans had crushed the Celtic world on mainland Europe, they invaded Britain. How did the many British tribes react to the impact of the Roman invasion? Did the legions of Rome drive the Celtic tribes of Britain to the Atlantic fringes, where they became the romantic underdogs of history? Roman writings not only tell us that the people of Britain spoke a similar language to the Celts of Gaul, but also that they shared a powerful class of religious leaders unique to the Celtic world, Druids. For the Romans to break the Celts, they first had to break the power of the Druids. Druids were doctors, priests, scientists and philosophers, all rolled into one, and their power lay in the fact that they were the only class of people who transcended tribal barriers.
I am the Druid Keeper of the Stones. My name's Terry. We were the philosophers of the Celtic peoples. We were there to try and answer the unanswerable questions, try and researched things like stars in the sky and the waxings and wanings of the moon and eclipses.
Modern Druids get their inspiration from Greek and Roman writers who tell us that the ancient Druids were powerful leaders who worshipped in oak groves and cut down mistletoe with golden sickles. But these classical sources also tell us something the modern Druid would rather forget. That the ancient Druids conducted savage religious rituals, including human sacrifice. Was this just Roman propaganda, or did it really happen? The answer may lie here, on the outskirts of Manchester. Lindo Common is a Cheshire peat bog and the site of an ancient crime scene. In 1984, a man's remains were found preserved in the peat. No one knew how long the body had lain there. Police forensics revealed that he died between AD 50 and AD 100. It was clear he'd been brutally murdered, but it was the nature of his injuries that made archaeologists consider the role of Druids and the existence of ritual sacrifice in Iron Age Britain.
This is Lindo Man, who is perhaps the best piece of evidence we have for ritual killing in the Iron Age.
So what makes you think he was ritually sacrificed rather than just murdered?
Well, this unfortunate man was found in the middle of a bog. The circumstances of his death, I think, provide proof that this is more than simply an unfortunate murder victim. He's found in a pond of water. He's naked except for a band of fox fur around his arm. And he's killed by firstly hitting him on the head with a blunt instrument. And you can still see this terrible wound today. He has around his throat a garrote. Now, whether that's to strangle him or to break his neck, because his neck is broken, his throat is cut. And it appears he's allowed to bleed. And then, if that hasn't actually killed him, he's placed face down in a pool of water.
That's what you call overkill.
I think this is it. This is definitely overkill. He's in water, and we know so much from the rest of Iron Age Europe that water is a special place for putting offerings to the gods at this time. So it adds to this evidence of him being a ritual killing.
It was the contents of Lindo Man's stomach that could give clues to his identity. It contained mistletoe pollen mixed with grain.
We know from one of the ancient writings that the mistletoe was supposed to be sacred to the Druids, and certainly since that mistletoe pollen was found in his stomach, people have always wanted to associate him with the Druids.
He was sacrificed just as the Romans were invading Britain. Is this how Britain's Celtic people reacted to invasion, with local Druids desperately trying to get help from the gods?
Imagine you're being conquered by the Roman army. This may well be exactly the time when you're trying to ask the gods, pleading for help against the invaders, perhaps.
Is it possible that he was a Druid?
That's a possibility. Certainly, when you look at his fingernails, for example, this was a person who did no hard labour before he died.
Now, to us, the human sacrifice is, in a way, the ultimate sacrifice, but do you think it was like that for them as well?
It's very difficult to say. I would say yes, that human sacrifice is an extraordinary step to take, but it's clearly a step which is fairly often taken in Iron Age Britain.
The sacrifice of Lindo Man may confirm the Romans' description of the Druids as barbaric. But we also know from the same writings that many British Druids were slaughtered when they tried to fight back the invaders. But the Druids weren't the only group of Celts to become the stuff of legend. The Romans had wiped out the Celtic world in Europe, and most of Britain became part of their empire. But there was one place that was never conquered. So hostile were the Celtic tribes of Scotland that the Romans built not one, but 2 walls to keep them at bay. The Romans called their mysterious and warlike enemies the Picts, a nickname that just means the painted people.
Hi there.
You're here to find out about the Picts.
That's exactly what I'm here for. So they were called the painted people by the Romans. Why was that?
We had a great love of painting our body, decorating our body. As you can see with Jim, he's doing a good job there.
Painted our bodies and the things we hunted, the stags and the salmon, and the knotwork. This is Pictish knotwork. There is a difference. I couldn't tell you what the difference is, but there is a difference.
So decoration, although it's got a practical value, it's maybe got some heraldic value to your clan or your tribe.
Like other Celtic tribes, the Picts didn't write things down. Instead, they painted symbols on their bodies.
This is the surface of the earth, and that's the surface of the sky, the limit of the sky. That's all the power. These are divining rods. It's in between the earth and the sky. But traditionally, the Pictish warrior was naked.
Must have been pretty scary.
The Picts were never a distinct ethnic group. They were a collection of British tribes. Just like the Gauls, they had come together to fight the Romans.
So you ready for this fighting formation?
Yeah, show me about it, yeah.
We're going to position you in the front line of this formation. Hope you don't mind.
I'll be the first to go, will I?
No, you'll be fighting well. We'll keep an eye on you.
While you're advancing forward, I will be protecting you. The chances are we are related, which makes me watch your back a hell of a lot.
Aiming at feet and at faces, and if you've got the skill, up, under and throats.
But if you're busy doing the business, I can come over and whack people, protect you also.
This is a fighting system that survived thousands of years.
So it must have worked.
It worked.
The skillful Celtic warriors the Romans called Picts were legendary. They were never defeated on their own soil by the Roman legions. 200 years after the Romans withdrew, the Picts were getting a new reputation. I've come to Tarbert on the northeast coast of Scotland to visit an astonishing archaeological site, a large Christian and Pictish monastery.
Come and see our latest discovery, Richard. There, this is what we just found.
Wow.
A Celt.
A
This
Celt.
is a Celt belonging to our Celtic monastery.
Now you say a Celt, but I understand this area has something to do with another people called the Picts.
The Picts, yes, we're in Pictish heartland. A Pict is simply a Briton who was living in Scotland, the east part of Scotland, that is, at that time. And the Romans gave them the nickname Pict, like painty, because they were tattooed.
He's a Pict, a Briton and a Celt. There are many levels to his identity. In the same way, I'm a Londoner, a Southerner, a Briton and European. Yet another level to his identity was his newfound faith as a Christian.
This is the ruin of our Celtic monastery. Church, burial ground, large stone monuments there. Here, workshops. Workshops either side of a road, and then mill, farm. So it's like a little town.
Many of Britain's pagan tribes adopted the new religion with enthusiasm. Pictish carving skills were now turned to express the Christian message.
That's come off a monument which has pictured a Celtic visionary. And look at those eyes. This person has seen beyond the present world. And the way that they represent that with those eyes is magical, I think, absolutely amazing.
Tarbert was much more than just a place of prayer and devotion, for these are the tools to make Christian manuscripts.
What's that then?
Now this is our greatest find to date. It doesn't look much, does it? It's a little pebble, and you see it's covered in paint. You see spots one side, and the other side a little cross. They're something the Picts had. Maybe they're amuletic, something like a little charm, keep in your pocket, your lucky pebble. But we've also found last week a small stylus, a bone stylus, which means that here people were being trained to write. So that's the end of the illiterate Picts, and we know that the Picts were writing and producing gospel books here in the northeast part of Scotland, round about the 7th or 8th century.
Pictish artists would inscribe their new faith with quill and chisel. Their remarkable standing stones would now combine a pagan heritage with Christian symbolism.
We see here a very advanced monastic community in the heart of Pictland, bringing with it beliefs which have been generated ultimately in Ireland from literature created in Greece and in Rome. You know, what a mixture. You know, these aren't barbarians, these are very well-read people. They're superlative artists, they're clearly intellectuals. These are people of the highest civilization.
The greatest legacy the Picts have left us are their mysterious standing stones.
Hi, Barry.
Many have suffered from hundreds of years of Scottish weather. Now I want to see what they would have looked like, fresh from the stonemason's hands. Sculptor Barry Grove has spent 4 years carving the first Pictish stone in over 1,200 years. This is a recreation of a monument which stood here in the 8th century. What can their stones tell us about Pictish culture?
The things you can easily say is that they knew a lot about symbolic language. They have no trouble not only imagining a vine scroll, but executing one perfectly. And then they have their own symbols done in beautiful Celtic artwork. And these are what distinguishes Pictish sculpture from all other sculpture, the symbols. And then this picture, which has got so much realism in, as usual, beautifully done by the Picts. It stood in the landscape, it was a memorial, but it's also a picture on their world and a picture on the next world.
The Picts, once classed as painted savages, were far from that. In fact, they were highly skilled and intelligent, and they embraced an imported faith. Where did this Christianity come from? There are clues in the landscape of settlers coming from across the Irish Sea. These 5th century stones are not Pictish. Found in western Scotland and Wales, they are carved with a simple script called Ogham, the first evidence of Celtic writing. The people who carved these stones had been raiding and settling in Britain for hundreds of years. The Romans called them Scotti. They would give both their Roman nickname and their Gaelic language to Scotland. We know them as the Irish. These Celtic raiders were the Christian warriors who converted the Picts. I followed the story of the pagan Celts. Now I want to find out why and how the Celts of Ireland became Christians. The new faith may have reached Ireland across the seas from Roman Gaul as early as the late 4th century AD. So I've come to the west coast of Ireland to meet someone who can show me the influence the seaways had on the Celtic world, and to discover how the new religion reached these shores.
Father Oath, Richard. Welcome.
Thank you.
We're going to go out there on the ocean for a while and
fantastic.
Have an experience of Celtic navigation.
Sounds terrific.
2,000 years or 3,000 years or something like that. So.
Made of hazel rods and cowhide, the curragh has been sailing the waters off Ireland for millennia.
Would you say it's a specifically Celtic style of boat?
That's what I think, yeah. It has survived then really only in Wales and in Ireland, like at the extremities of the Celtic movement, really. So that kind of helps the idea that it is very much a Celtic boat.
The Celts of the British Isles were masters of the sea.
Give it a bit of muscle, Richard.
And far from being isolated from the outside world, people and ideas flowed back and forth.
If you can work the oars, you're almost immune to the weather. It'll come in and out through surf. It feels really safe, and it feels safe in big seas.
Celtic missionaries carried the gospel in these fragile boats. They could easily have sailed as far as Brittany, Spain, and the Mediterranean.
The sea was the highway, so we see it as a barrier. My picture of the Celts is that you got to places from the shore to the shore. Yeah.
And what about Celtic Christianity? How do you see that as different?
Celtic Christianity is supposed to have come here through the Mediterranean. So you had a line from Egypt that brought Christianity to Ireland through sea routes, and this developed with a very strong connection with nature.
So really the boat in Celtic society was used for everything from spreading the gospel to going fishing, really.
Yeah, and in particular on pilgrimage. The early Christian Egyptians went to the desert to find God. The tradition in the Gaelic and Celtic tradition is you go on the ocean. That's the desert. That's where you go.
In the 6th century, the Irish Celts, inspired by these early Christian fathers, settled for the watery deserts of the ocean and the bleakest islands off their coast. I'm sailing 8 miles out into the North Atlantic off the far west coast of Ireland. I'm looking to find a place that perfectly sums up the unique spirit of what became Celtic Christianity. When the first Irish monks sailed to the island of Skellig Michael, they knew they had found their desert. It's a rocky crag, soaring vertically 700 feet out of the Atlantic Ocean. This is a truly awesome stairway to heaven. Built in 600 AD, the tiny monastery of Skellig Michael clings like a limpet to the rock. These beehive huts were home to a sacred community of Irish monks who, like their Druidic ancestors, worshipped in the wilderness.
Why did they choose this place? I mean, it is a bit out of the way.
It seems that at the time people were seeking to live in isolated places and to live monastic lives which were quite similar to those lived by the Desert Fathers in Egypt.
So this was in a way, their desert?
Absolutely. They may have felt that they were bringing the influence of Christ to the very edge of the world at the time.
Just to survive here was an art in itself.
Here we have what was probably the community cell, the place where the monks cooked and ate.
These Celtic monks were resourceful. Contemplation of the spiritual didn't mean they could overlook the bare necessities.
And here we have the most important and practical building for the monks. This is the necessarium, which
the
of course...
necessarium? What's that?
Basically, it's the monks' toilet. And of course, they may have been even more practical because this is one corner where there'd be almost no updraft.
What makes this early Irish tradition unique is that it draws together the Christian message and the pagan legacy of druid and warrior. The battle was not against a tribal enemy, but the spiritual enemy within, who could be defeated by extreme feats of endurance.
So how did it work? The monks were on the mainland, they saw this island, they thought that would be a hard and difficult place to live. Is that what it was all about, really?
Well, no, there may have been a little bit more romance and enthusiasm to it than that. Certainly, there was a penitential aspect to it. Of course, it's also interesting that pre-Christian druids did also go to solitary places, so there may be echoes of that as well.
So are you saying you think there might be an actual continuity between druids going into the wilderness and some of the early Irish monks doing the same by coming to places like this?
The echoes are definitely there.
The Druids had no written language, but they may well have spoken Latin and Greek. Now their Christian descendants would copy and so preserve ancient texts and the Bible that might otherwise have been lost with the fall of Rome. Travelling the high seas in their curraghs, Irish missionaries brought their Celtic version of Christianity to northwest Europe. In the year 563, St. Columba set himself adrift from his native island in a boat with neither oars nor sails. He left his destination to the whim of the sea and to the will of his God. And the place that he landed was to become a powerhouse of Celtic Christianity, the island of Iona. Iona was a sacred place even in pagan times. Before the time of St. Columba, there was a school of druids on the island. I've come to Iona, a cultural crossroads of the British Isles, because it was here where the most enduring icon of the Celtic world was created. The Book of Kells is a manuscript of Christian Gospels, which features page after page of lavish illumination and decoration. It's probably the most stunning expression of what we call Celtic art. But for me, it's more than that. It contains within its pages a coming together of many traditions: pagan, Pictish, Christian, Irish, Scottish. All these different flavours of Celticness can be found here.
Do we know who actually wrote the book?
No, we don't. Books of this period seldom say who, where, when. Here you've got a team of at least 8 artists and scribes, possibly even as many as 12, actually taking their turns at the benches in the scriptorium, all doing their bit to create something which was probably intended to celebrate the founder saint, Columba.
Weaving around the Latin text are layer upon layer of images, full of symbolism and hidden meanings, drawn from many different cultures.
When you look at the mixture of ornament and symbols that you've got in the Book of Kells, you can begin to see an incredibly complex world coming alive. It's a very, very beautiful symbol. You've got the Chi-Rho, which are the first letters of the word Christ in Greek, the X and the P. So you've got immediately a Greek symbol which explodes across the page, and it's become almost an icon in its own right. So when you look into the arms of the X, for example, you've got all of this incredible spiral work that goes right back to Latin and to the Iron Age ornament that we associate traditionally with Celtic culture.
Some of these motifs were already 1,000 years old when inscribed into this manuscript.
And then you've got all sorts of other symbols layered in here too. For example, you've got a little human head at the end of the row, and this is the passage where it's talking about the birth of Christ. So it's when Christ becomes human, so you've got the human coming in there. So time and time again you can penetrate this mystery, and it's a bit like the kids' game of Where's Wally?
You'll never find Wally in here though, but I did find something else. Could this be a pagan Pict?
It's hard to imagine that Picts would still have been personally tattooed or painted by around 800, so this again is a recollection back to their history as a people.
What role do you think the book has to play in modern Ireland?
Well, obviously it's become, if you like, the big symbol of Celticness, Irishness. Some people are very, very shocked when you suggest that the book wasn't actually made on Irish soil, that it was likely to have been made off of the coast of Scotland on the little island of Iona.
The Book of Kells is an icon of Celtic art. People think it's purely Irish, but its influences actually come from all over Europe.
I think some of the symbols that people think of as Celtic in it actually are misunderstood. For example, the Celtic knot that again you see on table mats, scarves, sweaters, everything, isn't actually a Celtic design. It's something that goes back to the Germanic world and to its relationship with the Roman army. But really it's after all of the different peoples of Britain and Ireland have pooled their designs and their experiences that you get these things growing out. And then of course they're appropriated as Celtic.
The Book of Kells is not a simple icon of Irish Celtic identity. In this manuscript are the cultural fingerprints of Picts, Britons, Irish, Scots and Anglo-Saxons too. It was upon these diverse traditions that Celtic Christianity was built.
Well, the peoples we think of as Celtic never ever do things by halves. It's always with passion and you throw yourself into it. And there was a lot about previous pagan religion, I think, that lends itself well and maps onto Christianity. The idea of water as a source of life and of rebirth would lead straight to the idea of baptism, for example. The idea of heroes who would sacrifice everything on behalf of their people is something that appealed very much to both the gods and the warriors of pagan mythology. It's something that I think would have been often almost effortless as a transition, and you can imagine many Druids converting almost overnight and becoming monastic founders or members of communities.
There's so many connections between paganism and Christianity that it's not really surprising that Ireland's Celtic icon is a cross. Christianity was a smooth transition rather than a break with the past. The descendants of the ancient Druids, the Irish monks, laboured in isolated monasteries transcribing manuscripts by hand. The Celtic world, long reviled by the Greeks and Romans, preserved the knowledge of the classical world and exported it back to Europe with Christian missionaries. The Celtic Church would be the link between the Dark Ages and the later medieval world that succeeded it. I'm now back in Dublin, having travelled 4,000 miles across the ancient Celtic world. Today, Ireland proudly presents itself as a firmly Celtic country that still speaks a Celtic language. Ireland has to be the place to confront the final question. What makes someone a Celt? Is it their culture, their language, or their blood? And where better to find the answer than Dublin, home to some of the greatest treasures of the Celtic world. The legacy of a culture that spans over 2,000 years.
So I've never seen anything like this boat before. It really is special, isn't it?
It's a very, very special one. This really is an exquisitely made piece. You can see all the fittings of the boat, the oars and the masts.
So would you say it was made by a Celt?
Well, it was made by a goldsmith working in Ireland. Whether you would call them Celts or not, they certainly wouldn't have called themselves Celts.
So why is Ireland seen as a Celtic country?
Being Celtic is a good marketing ploy, I think. There is an interest in the Celt and things Celtic, and I think Irish people cleverly capitalise on that.
Are you saying that the Celtic identity is elusive, or is it just an illusion?
I think it's largely an illusion.
So if the Irish aren't Celtic, what are they?
Well, Irish is what we have called ourselves for a very long time.
No reason to change there then? No?
I don't think so, no. Well, maybe European is the next big label that we'll all be embracing.
Lots of people will be shocked to hear that the Irish aren't Celts at all. And if the Irish aren't Celts, what about the Scots and the Welsh? What the archaeology has shown me is that Celticness is about culture, not race. But people still cling on to the idea that they have Celtic genes. I want to nail this down once and for all. If archaeology and language alone can't provide the answers, then maybe DNA can.
We find Ireland interesting because we're Irish, we work here, everybody wants to know something about their origins, about the past.
Dan Bradley and his team have collected DNA from all over Europe. They were searching for evidence of a genetic link across the Celtic world to see if people migrated from the continent to Britain and Ireland. The results were surprising.
What we have here is if you like, a weather map of the genetics of Europe. And if you look at the contour that Ireland gives a signal of, it seems to share a similarity along the Atlantic facade. What it doesn't do is show any particular affinity, it just shows difference moving towards Central Europe.
Your genetic evidence seems to sit very well with the Celtic languages, but it doesn't seem to sit well with this idea of this great migration.
Yes.
So really you're saying the Irish have always been here?
As have the Welsh and the Scottish. I think it's very credible that the population of this island hasn't changed that much since the start of farming 6,000 years ago.
There's no genetic evidence that there was once a Celtic race, an ethnic basis to the shared culture we call Celtic. And yet there is a common language link with Europe. So the Celtic languages must be much older than the Iron Age Celtic culture by thousands of years, long before the Greeks ever coined the word Celt. Who were the Celts? One thing I can say for certain, they weren't a race of Iron Age immigrants, and there never was a European Celtic empire or one ethnic group who called themselves Celts. The word Celt conveniently labels many of the tribes of Europe, but it obscures the brilliant diversity of Iron Age peoples. The modern Celt is more of a myth than reality, but there is a real sense of Celtic identity in Scotland, Wales and Ireland. What does it mean to be Celtic today? If in Ireland they claim that they are Irish first and European second, well, you can't get more Celtic than that.